Thank you, guys. And thank you, everybody, for being here this evening. I'm actually going to mess with the polls a little bit and just kind of get to know everybody while I'm introducing myself. So I'm going to shoot one poll out real quickly. Oh, I'm going to try to shoot a poll out real quickly. Let's see if I can figure out how to do it. So this one, hopefully, just ask you how many years you've been teaching AP English language. I've been teaching AP English language for 23 years. I'm in my 24th year of teaching, and I kind of got roped into doing it early when I had no idea what was going on. Now, here we are. Like most of you, I teach a variety of things. So right now I'm doing on-level English 3, AP Lang to juniors, and I'm also teaching AP Seminar to juniors. So far, the only thing I've not taught at the secondary level are freshmen, and that's probably best for all of us. I know that's maybe not the nicest thing to say, but they scare me, quite frankly. So hopefully this evening what I can do is just share some insights about conversations involving the new writing multiple choice questions. I already saw a couple questions go into the Q&A. One was about teaching the MC strategies when we are cut for instructional time. And that's actually something specifically that we're going to look at tonight, is trying to talk about how to help our students understand conceptually what the writing multiple choice questions talk about, so that we should be able to spend less time on the test prep with them. Which, with that in mind, I'm actually going to shoot another poll out real quickly, just so that I can, again, get a sense of how familiar we are with the writing multiple choice questions. So if you just take a second to respond to this, I'm focusing on the CED just because it's a common resource and because I have a little bit of that content in the presentation this evening. And so I want to just get an idea of how much time I should spend with it. While you guys are doing that poll, oh, nobody's memorized them yet? What's going on? Excellent. All righty. So I think I'll get us going this evening. We're familiar with them. That's excellent. So we'll get going with the slides themselves. I'm going to get the deck pulled up for me. Working in my first time in this platform, so mostly I'm trying to make sure I don't screw anything up. Yeah. Okay, so when we start talking about the concept behind the new writing multiple choice, this is some content that Aubrey Ludwig and I presented when we've done writing multiple choice presentations in the past. And this, I think, is a really important idea from the course overview in the new CED. And notice the blue text, the highlighted blue text, right? AP English Language and Composition course focuses on the development and revision of evidence-based analytic and argumentative writing. And the key there is that idea of revision. So one of the things that moving to the framework and the clear identification of skills in the framework allows us to do is, when we're developing assessment, we can make sure that we actually are looking at those skills as accessible items. And the writing multiple choice starts to move towards this idea of revision. And so you can see the bulleted list down there, right? The idea for the writing multiple choice is to examine, review, and evaluate draft writing, to revise draft writing focused on core skills. Of course, you recognize the abbreviations for the big ideas there. And then to prioritize the importance of drafting and revision in the composition classroom. This is something that prior to the framework in the CED, we really couldn't assess. There was not a way to assess drafting or revision with our 40-minute timed writing activities. And so a new opportunity presented itself as we started identifying the skills of reading and the skills of writing in terms of the CED. course, the question became, we still don't have time to have students write a draft and then revise it. So how can we approximate that? How can we try to get students to demonstrate the skills that revision of a piece of writing, or the skills they need to revise a piece of writing? And these questions started to develop from that process. And so a quick comment then, the goal of these, even though we know that we have got style and there are lots of grammar issues that our students need to learn so that they can compose in an academic context, the purpose of these questions is really not to assess grammar. And actually, in working with them now for several years, I feel like the closest thing we're going to see to a grammar question is a misplaced modifier question. And we know that, of course, that's relevant from a content standpoint because misplaced modifiers end up creating confused context. And so I think the hope here is that we move students beyond, ACT is big in Oklahoma, and so we move students beyond that sort of ACT approach to these kind of questions, and instead have them really thinking about how students think about writing, think about changing writing after they have that first draft done, and then putting that into a context of multiple choice. So my sense is students who have had to do revision of their own writing or have done peer revision and provided others feedback, these questions, they're by nature time consuming, just like they are when students are taking the ACT, but they shouldn't necessarily be a massive cognitive load. I think the challenge is if students haven't done revision work, then these questions will be very decentering from them because they just haven't had to think about these kinds of things before. So just some quick reminders about the structure of the exam. Since we are going to have the full exam this year, this is going to be the breakdown of the multiple choice questions. So 2 reading passages and the associated questions, then 3 writing passages and their associated questions. You see that here. And something that I think in the drinking from a fire hose that has often been the introduction to the CED, one of the things that hopefully was said, but that I just think gets washed in everything, is look at how the skills assessed column reads over here. Notice that the reading skills are all of the odd numbers, so 1, 3, 5, and 7, whereas the writing skills and what are assessed in these writing multiple choice questions are the even skills. And that ends up being really important because inevitably when we're doing exam prep, we start thinking about question stems. And is there a bank of question stems? And the answer for these is no, as far as a published bank of question stems, but in many ways, yes, because the CED outlines what we can assess and tells the development committee the breadth or the scope of what it is that we can ask students to do inside the assessment. So the only kinds of questions that we will ask students when it comes to these writing multiple choice questions are based off of these even numbered skills. So you can go and pull an even numbered skill and you can look at the language of that skill and morph it into a potential question for one of these writing multiple choice questions. Now, I asked earlier about our familiarity with the sample writing multiple choice questions in the CED because we've got some content from there in this slide deck. And so I'm not going to take the time to read this to everybody because it looks like the vast majority of us have looked at these writing multiple choice. One thing I do want to point out, though, is you'll notice the yellow highlight at the top of the page. When students are working with these are designed as draft passages. They will have errors in them. And really, for me, if you think in terms of student writing, quite often these are indicative of my middle high to high students as far as the quality of the draft. They're often students who are very grammatically proficient and they learned those lessons, but they aren't necessarily making all of the right rhetorical choices yet. They're often students who maybe aren't as avid readers as our absolute highest performers, and so they don't have that natural sound for language yet. So the other thing you'll see is that the sentences are numbered because that's how we will ask them to deal with these questions or these sentences in the actual questions themselves. So all features that we can make sure that students see and that they understand conceptually. So here's question 9 from the set that went with that passage about NASA's lander. And I'm going to go back one second. And the whole idea about whether we should use the metric system or not, right? And so this one asks students to think about the introduction, right? Which of the following sentences, if placed before sentence 1, and then notice the bold, the blue print here, right? And where that ends up being really relevant is oh, sorry, I clicked that button too quickly, is to its connection to the skill category down below. So notice that it asks about capturing the audience's attention and being the most effective introduction to the topic of the paragraph. Excuse me. And let's look down at the skill at the bottom of the page where we're talking about introductions and conclusions are appropriate to the purpose and context of the rhetorical situation. The introduction of an argument introduces the subject and or writer of the argument to the audience. An introduction may present the argument's thesis. An introduction may orient, engage, focus the audience by presenting quotations, intriguing statements, anecdotes, questions, statistics, data, textual information, or a scenario. You guys can read all of that. But notice how there's been an attempt to pull some of that language and some of those ideas into the question stem about the effective introduction, about capturing the audience, right? So those are the kinds of things that when we look at these question stems, we can pull students towards. So when we look at the question itself, one of the things that ends up being a key is that the second sentence that the students are trying to modify, right? Because remember, they're inserting this sentence before. One of the key ideas there is unsuccessful search. And I know that one of the concerns has been, well, what are students revising for if that's the purpose of this question? How are they supposed to make this engaging and transition to the topic of the paragraph? And so this introductory clause in sentence 1 with the unsuccessful search, that's something that all of the correct answers will, or on questions like this, the correct answer will have to key into, right? If it doesn't introduce content that doesn't connect to the idea of an unsuccessful search, then it's not going to be the best answer in the cycle. And that, I think, has been one of the things to get students to think about. And one of the things that I know I'm working with my students is to try and get them to make sure that when they're looking at a draft like this and they're trying to think about how to improve it, where are those key connectors that would take an additional sentence? In this case, you've got answer option A that's incorrect, and have it work smoothly into the rest of the paragraph or the rest of the item that students are being asked to work with. And then if you've looked at the CED, you'll notice that you have these justifications in there, right? There are the explanations for why these are correct or incorrect. And so I won't belabor that point because that's information that we have access to. But in these justifications, you'll see that they end up talking about if you're going to introduce an audience and engage their attention, right, then aghast and vanished would do that, particularly as it's leading into the idea of an unsuccessful search, which of course is emphasized down there. And then from there, since the rest of the answers are incorrect, you'll see that they really are functioning at the exact same level, right? That yes, these all have to do with the passage, but they don't really make that connection to after an unsuccessful search is the introductory clause. And so they end up not being the best answer option. Okay, so I want to stop there for a second, and I'm going to hop over to the Q&A and see if I can answer some of those questions real quickly before we start talking about classroom strategies. So are the SAT writing and language questions a good resource for the practice? Katie, I'm going to hesitantly answer that one because Oklahoma is ACT country and not SAT. And so I'm not as familiar with them. I think the big answer to any test prep resource in relationship to these questions is, are they actually moving students to thinking about the rhetorical choices and adapting content in relationship to forwarding an argument? If they're grammar-oriented questions, then probably not so much. And so I can't speak specifically to the SAT ones, but I think that that's a guide for us. Carlin, so the intent is for students to have read the whole passage. My students get lots of test prep on something like the ACT where they try to answer each question in isolation and they really don't pay attention to the content of the passage as a whole. This is really intended to do the exact opposite. And in fact, students will often be asked to add a sentence based off of its relationship to the context of the passage as a whole, or they might be asked to evaluate some charged language to match the tone of the entire passage. And so those kinds of things, I think, is something to really make sure that the passage is seen as an entire entity and they're making revisions in relationship to that. And that's one of the reasons why you'll notice we've dropped from traditionally 55 questions down to 45 questions in what the students are being asked to do. And it's because we know that these are going to take longer for students to do. They're just going to be a longer read. And so we need to help them understand that. Let's see. When you say explanations in C, you mean individualized MC questions? Aaron, I believe so, unless I'm misspeaking. And hopefully that's accurate. Lisa, okay, so in AP Classroom, if you go to the question bank and you have the option to filter questions, there is a filter that will get you to just the writing MC questions, and I think there are over 90 of them now. Just remember that the majority of those are on the 3 practice exams. And so those require students to use the lockdown browser if they're going to answer those questions. So use those judiciously, or at least be careful when you're assigning them. That's an excellent question. So my teaching context right now is a weird hybrid model where I only see my students face-to-face 2 days a week. And so we have not done a full practice of anything because that's not how I'm choosing to spend my time right now. So I don't have a great sense of whether the rhetorical analysis questions or the writing questions are going to take more time yet. Based off of the weight load, if you go back to that earlier slide, it's still about 50-50. And so with that being the case, I think that most of the time, I'm still going to have my students shoot for about 15 minutes a piece on those reading ones, and then dividing their time between the 3 writing multiple choice questions or multiple choice passages as fits the number of questions that are associated with it, because 2 of them will be slightly longer and 1 of them will then be, of course, a little bit shorter. So yeah, I think that's still the great unknown for all of us because we didn't really have the responsibility of practicing it last year. And so that's going to be second semester. Test prep stuff will be second semester for me this year. So we're just not even moving into that. So, okay. So please continue to add stuff into the Q&A as you think of it. I just wanted to make sure and take a second to check that before we talk about teaching this. And I think that hopefully is really what a whole bunch of us are really wanting to focus on this evening, is trying to think about what this looks like in our classroom, right? One of the things that I am doing to introduce these skills to my students, as opposed to necessarily thinking about introducing the actual test items themselves, is to find draft arguments, because remember, that's what these passages are based off of, and try to make sure that I'm getting those in front of my students and we talk about them as revision activities. So this slide is just a cookie crumb trail about how to get to student samples that are available to us on AP Central. My students are very hesitant to do revision work on their own writing and each other's writing to start off with. And so my hope is that by giving them completely anonymous writing, a lot of that trepidation and that fear of hurting each other's feelings will go away, and instead, you know, they'll feel free to tear it apart because they're not afraid of insulting anybody in the room. So the big issue is because of how AP Central is now structured, you need to get to those past exam questions. And so even after you followed the cookie crumb trail, or if you're like me, when you start typing into a Google search, you get to AP Central and AP Lang and exam pops up almost immediately because of how often I go there. If you scroll to the bottom of the exam page, about 4/5 of the way down, you'll see this tab for past exam questions. And so this is a treasure trove of high, medium, and low responses where we can start having our students look at draft arguments and think about that in the context of these questions, right? How do we revise them? So here is an example from, I pulled from the 2013 prompt. I would suggest pulling from synthesis or argument prompts, just because that's the kind of writing that students are going to see on these writing multiple choice questions, as opposed to pulling from passage analysis, because I don't think we're going to ask students to do a revision of a passage analysis. They're doing revisions of arguments. And so if you're familiar with it, you can see that this is the ownership and sense of self prompt. And I'll vamp here for a second so that people who are unfamiliar with it can read through it. But again, the goal for this prompt was for students to develop that position on the relationship between these two nuanced ideas, and then of course support it with evidence from experience observation. You guys remember the list that we have historically had on the assessment. And so since we're working with a strong sample, we're probably going to be focusing on the kind of different levels of questions and thinking about what we want students to do. So I'm going to click on from this so that we can make sure and move through this content so that we can get to another Q&A session. Actually, I just saw a question go in, so I want to check it real quickly. Oh, okay. It looks like all the same ones. So, okay. So here is the introduction from this high sample, right? And it says, sorry, I'm gonna switch a screen, there we go. In American society, the classic American dream is characterized through home ownership. People memorialize the day they purchased their first car or invested their own money into the stock exchange for the first time. All of these monumental events stem from a uniform theme of ownership. The notion of purchasing items to gain either social class or material objects is a highly controversial and debatable topic. This determination to unearth a relationship between ownership and sense of self has plagued philosophers for centuries. Ownership marks certain goals in human society, but can also lead to an individual's downfall. So the strategy in the classroom, of course, is to get students talking about what are the strengths and weaknesses of this paragraph. Right. And we kind of see what is typical, I think, with a good student starting off with a timed writing. The first 3 sentences, or at least the first 2, are, you know, sort of the same idea, just regurgitated in a different way. And then they're gradually transitioning into something that's much more on task with the prompt. So getting students then to think in terms of what could be addressed in this, because there's nothing really horrible about it, right? And there's not a lot to fix. So, You could get students to focus by asking a question like this. The author would like to combine these two sentences into a more concise, compelling statement to better engage an audience. What suggestions would you make to rewrite these ideas? And in class, certainly you could have them try to do that revision, dependent upon what you're doing with social distancing, if you're face-to-face, or maybe if you're in a virtual context, but you can use breakout rooms. You can imagine getting students working in groups to try to think about how to revise this. And of course, the goal isn't necessarily to come up with a correct answer per se, but it's to get them thinking about the skill of writers revisit their writing and they work writers revisit their writing and then they work to revise it so that it ends up being better. And you can imagine in a multiple choice context, we would take this exact same thing, but instead of saying, what suggestion would you make to rewrite these ideas, we'd give them A, B, C, D, E. And they would have some different options and would have to then make a decision about which of those combinations would be the best when it came to engaging an audience, right? So again, notice how I'm just thinking about the kinds of question stems and then, or the different skills that could be question stems, those even numbered skills. And then I'm thinking about moments in this passage where I could have students try to address this in an actual piece of writing as opposed to just in some multiple choice practice. Let's see. Aaron, you said, do you do this after they have written this type of essay before? Yes, because I have my students do their own kinds of writing before we actually start looking at any of the exam-based stuff. That's just kind of how I work my own scope and sequence. I don't think that that's the right way to do it. That's just how I've done it in the past. So, okay, another example from this same paragraph, right? We've got the next two sentences in the progression. The author wants to create a smoother transition between the hook and the thesis statement. How might the author adjust this statement? Again, even making some suggestions about sentence combination techniques to more effectively engage the audience. And one of the things that's nice about this from a classroom instruction standpoint is that this gives us a chance to do some mini lessons on grammar and thinking about style in the CED. And those later unit contents that I think are sometimes hard for us to get to, dependent upon, well, especially this year in modified instructional practices. So finding these kinds of moments can really allow us to spend 5 or 10 minutes working on this idea and then just keep moving in a much more natural conversation about getting a piece to evolve, right? Or another option, right? The author is concerned that the tone of has plagued isn't the best choice for a qualified thesis in the introduction. So what options might better fit the tone of the essay? And hopefully what you can hear is just the kinds of questions that are in the question bank that are getting students to really think about revising for clarity and trying to make those writerly choices that we know happen within the professional writing community, right? Okay, so what does this look like in a body paragraph? Well, here's the first body paragraph from this response. And quite frankly, it's not bad. It's got a lot of personal voice. It certainly gives us a vivid hypothetical situation about the 7-year-old who's walking to the store to purchase something with their hard-earned cash. The grammar is a little bit funky in it, but I also think it's important that students look at some of these and not try to tear everything apart. When you look at the writing multiple choice answer options, students will often be given an answer option that says keep as is. And so they do need to be aware that part of the task of being a good writer is knowing what works and then what needs to evolve. And not just changing everything for the sake of changing everything. So with this question, again, not lots that I would necessarily spend time on. We could rewrite a few sentences for fluency, but not necessarily something that has a content problem with the way it's presented. Now, Here's the next body paragraph from this student, right? Ownership also teaches perseverance. It assists humans in setting goals and striving for said goals. Personally, upon turning 17, I was determined to purchase my own car. For 2 years leading up to my birthday, okay, and now I've got a time problem because I think they want to buy a car when they were 17, except for they said, personally, upon turning 17, I determined, right? Like we've got some chronology problems there. So that's a content issue. Then for 2 years leading up to my birthday, I worked hard to regulate the money. I earned placing huge sums into the bank. This goal came into fruition when I finally could afford a car. It's not the shiniest, fastest, or most opulent vehicle available, but owning my own car made me proud. It was a goal to strive for, a constant desire propelling me forward. Ownership can allow humans to manage themselves and can instill pride and self-accomplishment. Okay, lovely. So again, what can be changed here? And again, a nice option for grammatical mini lessons where we could talk about semicolons with those first couple of sentences. Down here, the second batch that I've got highlighted, we can start talking about teaching dashes and some other stylistic choices for students. These are moments that I really look for in class. Comma splices or these sorts of weird comma joinings are actually really important moments for me. These are perfect examples of students who are moving from concrete to abstract thinking, and they don't have the grammatical structures to convey that new complexity. And so this is a wonderful time to show them this in a non-threatening way because it's not their paper with a red circle around a comma error. But instead, they get that feedback without necessarily having to have that personal attack. I know they shouldn't feel it that way, but they do, right? Additionally, in this one, here's that chronology problem that I pointed out when I was reading it. So again, what suggestions could be made to help the author's evidence, clarify the author's evidence? Great activity for students to rewrite some of this. But again, you can imagine anything that we're asking the students to rewrite and rethink automatically becomes a moment where you could have A, B, C, D, E with various options and trying to help students pick the best one of those, okay? So the paper goes on, and I'm trying to be mindful of our time. So I think I'm just going to show you guys how I would approach this, but I'm not going to read this whole text since you'll have a chance to go back to this content in the recording. So again, here's a section where the author is concerned about the redundancy of these two sentences. How might the author revise them, right? Or another opportunity, the author is concerned that there's not enough specificity in this evidence. How might the author adjust the content to provide the reader with more tangible evidence that will more clearly convey the argument? In one of those writing multiple choice questions, you can imagine that being a student is considering inserting one of the following pieces of evidence after sentence 8. Which of the following would be best? And then A, B, C, D, E would be different kinds of evidence, and students would need to pick the one that best matched the preceding claim, right? So lots of opportunities here to get our students thinking like the multiple choice questions without necessarily having to spend the time of doing multiple choice testing. Not that there isn't value in that, but as somebody pointed out in the questions, you know, I think that was, oh shoot, that's disappeared. But we just don't really have as much time to work with this stuff this year. And so getting them into it conceptually will hopefully then make our test prep exactly that, just getting them used to testing format as opposed to necessarily teaching it in the test or teaching the test, right? Another option, the author's concerned that a reader might see these sentences as contradicting the assertion developed in previous paragraphs. How might the author revise to ensure the reader sees this as a qualified assertion and not a contradiction, right? So making sure that that phrasing is clear, particularly when they're moving back and forth between Aristotle and Plato in this prompt, all right? And even finally, the last sentence, the author isn't sure whether the underlined sentence is acting as commentary or claim. Which is it? Should the author keep or delete this sentence? And so that's a question type that students will see in these writing multiple choice. They'll be asked to consider revising this section, and two of the options might say, keep it because, and then there would be different reasons to keep it. And the next 3 answer options might say delete it because, and 3 different reasons for deleting it. So again, we have to be having these really authentic conversations with our students about how do you improve a piece of writing and why do you make those choices, so that they have that as a vocabulary set and as a skill set before they're even looking at these multiple choice questions. Without it, in some ways, I could see these questions as being very obtuse and very difficult to maneuver through. And in the opposite end, if students become very proficient in either reviewing their own writing or providing good peer feedback, then the questions will imitate the kinds of thinking that they have already done, right? Okay, so I would love for all of my student writing to look like that, but it doesn't. And so the reality is using the medium student writing sample will probably do more to help move my students along, improve their own writing, most importantly, but still prep them for the writing multiple choice. And that's by looking at something that's not quite as strong of a draft, right? So this one is in relationship to the Oscar Wilde prompt about disobedience and how that leads to social progress, right? And you guys can skim it there real quickly. Again, the goal here is not to really do a deep dive on the prompt, but just see how we can leverage the essay to imitate these multiple choice questions. So this is an example where I've pulled the 2 different introductions from this. And then you can think about asking students to discuss the different qualities of these 2 introductions, right? And in this case, I would want students focusing on these transitions that happen that help convey a line of reasoning. Oh, there's that phrase, right? To lead me through the essay, right? The last part of that is crucial, meaning the previous quote, only by applying a force with the motion of any object. In a similar vein, it's through disobedience and rebellion that social progress can be made. And so this is a student who, if we think about style in the CED, is leveraging introductory clauses. They have an understanding of coordination of different phrases so that this has that flow, right, that students are always looking for. And when you look at the medium sample, of course, it doesn't have those same kinds of things. And perhaps more important, the student kind of moves away from the phrase social progress from the prompt and instead says disobedience promotes the questioning of societal norms, historical change, and progressive thought. So that's a concern here, is that the student's imprecise language is moving them away from the prompt. But that does give us something to think about in terms of the writing multiple choice, because this phrasing isn't as strong to keep it aligned with the purpose of the passage. We don't have to turn that into a multiple choice question to make sure that students are thinking about the roles that those sorts of language choices make in conveying clear arguments. So this is all the same kind of stuff that I did previously. As you would expect, there's probably more content stuff to discuss. So here's a sample body paragraph where the student decides to talk about civil disobedience and its role in social progress, right? And so again, we've got different things that we can ask the students to think about, right? This evidence is vague. How might an author add additional sentences to create more specificity, right? In class conversation, we want them coming up with those answers, but you can see how that could turn into which of the following sentences would best replace sentence 6 in the passage. And then you would have an A, B, C, D, E coming down underneath it. Or next, the student makes a more specific statement here, but then it lacks commentary. So in class, I want the students to have a discussion about how they could get this information connected back to the thesis statement. But as a multiple choice question, I could certainly do which of the following sentences inserted after this number, whatever it is, would best provide commentary for this evidence, A, B, C, D, E, right? So practicing the skill without necessarily practicing the test in this context. So finally, this student has a really interesting anecdote that barely connects to the paragraph as a whole, but I know what the student's saying, right? Well-behaved women seldom make history is a reference back to the Rosa Parks evidence that was given up here. But the commentary just doesn't quite make it, right? So now we've got to think about, is this the best anecdote to add in? What additional commentary could we add to make it better? Again, different skills that we would ask students to consider when it came to the actual assessment. And then a point that I like to make on this one is the student finishes the paragraph by saying, again, the idea of disobedience as a driver for historical change is clear. Well, that connects back to the student's thesis, but remember the prompt was about social progress, not just historical change. So I think that this is one of those examples where we would want the student to align this commentary more tightly with the original thesis and the original prompt if we're thinking in terms of answering the free response question, okay? There are a couple of questions going into the Q&A, and I will hop back over to that in just a second. We've only got a couple more slides, and I want to make sure that I finish that up, and then we'll hit that info. So, final thoughts. One of the things that I am attempting to do more in class is to get students to really undertake revision, but not necessarily of an entire essay. So a way to transition students out of this work in AP Central is to go to one of their own papers and take a body paragraph, for example. And you can see here I've suggested that they keep the claim, but let's say that they used research evidence. Okay, then do you change that evidence and add commentary? Or what if you have an anecdote as your evidence? Okay, take that out and go do some research and change how you're supporting that claim. Okay, how do you revise your commentary to adjust based off of changing the evidence? And so again, those are those same kinds of writerly choices that we want students trying to think about when they are looking at their own writing or when they are trying to provide revision for other folks. And again, we're trying to figure out, how do I get peer revision to be something that's a really productive activity, as opposed to either, you know, the one person in the room who's the grammar Nazi who's shredding everybody else's paper, or the exact opposite, which is getting somebody who looks at a piece of writing, but they don't know what feedback to give. And so they're just like, wow, that was good. You write pretty. And that's not helpful feedback either. But if they've had to do this sort of substitution work in their own writing, then making that kind of suggestion to somebody else is a much safer ask, and it's a much safer space for everybody to occupy because it's something that they've had to consider in their own writing. And then finally, so many of us do stuff with 3 colors. I know that's an old Jane Schaefer idea, but before I have students do peer revision, they trade their papers with each other and they highlight their claim, their evidence, and their commentary. So that when they are doing peer revision, it gives them the opportunity to look very specifically at what the student thinks they've done and then whether it's actually accomplished that. So the conversations in my classroom around this peer feedback is no longer about surface level commas and periods and capitalization, and instead is really diving much deeper into that kind of content, right? Okay, so I'm sorry for plowing through all of that, but I wanted to make sure that there was a bunch of strategies shared, because I know that's one of our big questions. And then I am going to try to hop over to the Q&A and see if I can answer. I know that Tim and some others have perhaps been doing that this evening. Let's see, the Albert I.O., I'm afraid I can't help with that one. Let's see. Karen, when we teach rhetorical analysis, it's helpful for many students to use a bank of concept terms to support them. Is there anything similar to support them with these writing multiple choice questions? Well, I think one of the things that I feel like we're focusing on quite a bit is this idea of claim evidence commentary, of trying to get students to think about clarity in writing, some of those really kind of fundamental terms that you see throughout the CED. Because again, our goal here is going to be to try to make sure that students have the opportunity to demonstrate their understanding of that skill, not only in reading somebody else's writing, but then in what it means to go back and reevaluate those in context. So I really feel like the majority of the time these questions are geared much more towards those kinds of substantive rhetorical choices. Let's see. Is a three-pronged thesis the best way to go for essay writing? Brian, I think on that one, at least as far as it applies to the writing multiple choice, that's not necessarily something that students will necessarily or should look for when it comes to the thesis of these draft arguments. And so I think that aside from what that means in the student writing, I think that we probably need to help students understand that that three-pronged thesis is a way to do a thesis statement, but it's not the only way when it comes to writing a thesis statement, especially if they're asked to do any work with the thesis statement in the writing multiple choice. So I know that that doesn't address the essay idea specifically, but I think it does remind us that the thesis statement can look very differently dependent upon the piece of writing. Let's see. How do we help students manage time in this section? Some students struggle with going back and plugging in the answers without losing time. Yeah, Teresa, I think that's a completely fair question. And I think that the biggest thing that we will have to practice with them, but then hang our hat on, is that they have 10 fewer questions to answer than they've had in the past. Quite frankly, reading these draft writings is going to be an easier ask than when they were having to read the additional reading multiple choice passages back when it was 4 reading multiple choice passages. So I'm hoping that the time won't be as big of a struggle for students, just because we've tried to open up some space so that they can spend more time doing these tasks. We do have that conversation in the development committee when we're looking at potential questions and we're approving them so that they can make their way out onto the assessment. We are very mindful of that. We really are trying to think about the cognitive load, because we understand that doing this kind of substitution work with which is the best version of sentence, combining sentences 1 and 2 kind of task, it does require students to do a lot more reading and a lot more substituting, as you're suggesting. My only hope, and the one thing that does seem to make some difference for my students, is when they're used to thinking like that, when they're used to looking at 2 or 3 sentences and thinking of them as a combination activity, then the cognitive load of that question is easier, and they can often eliminate some of those answer options faster just because they can tell that they aren't, although grammatically correct, they're not necessarily effective combinations from a thought standpoint or from a clarity standpoint. Oh, Aaron has a good question about copy the question and answers from the chat. That one slides above my pay grade, Aaron. I'm not completely sure on that one. I'll see if somebody else can't slide in and help with that one. Okay, other questions, folks? Let's see. Is there a bank of terms called out separately from the CED, such as commentary and claim? Mia, I think I've seen some of those floating around. I don't know if somebody shared one on the Facebook group or not. I know that some teachers have tried to go through and do that. College Board and the Development Committee has not done something explicitly like that. But I know that other teachers have tried to create that as a shared resource for folks. Let's see, focusing efforts on helping students edit their own writing and hope that work transfers the MC exam. Yeah, Paul, that's actually exactly the approach that I'm taking with my students. My focus is really going to be much more on this activity, these revision activities, both with release student samples and then eventually with their own writing. And then I'm hoping that once we get to late February or early March, we'll do some of these. I am using the PPCs in AP Classroom. And so my students are getting some exposure to those already. And so that's the other thing I'm being mindful of. Like, I don't have to do all of that question introduction this year necessarily, because by assigning the units in the PPC and having students watch the daily videos with a number of excellent people doing them, not me, then they are getting some of that experience and they are getting some of that exposure to these multiple choice question items, even if we're not necessarily actively doing them in class. All righty. Waiting to see if we've got any other questions popping in. Which skills could we focus more on due to the limited face time with students? You'll notice I'm really hitting claim evidence commentary and then getting students to think in terms of those kinds of stylistic introductions. I do think that that's something that consistently comes up in these writing multiple choice questions, is getting students to think about the role and the engagement of an introduction, because that's where we can really target rhetorical situation and students, the writer's understanding of an audience, and that writers make intentional choices for audience. So whether it's with our student writing or with student revision, working on solid commentary, really solid evidence to support claims, and then thinking about how the introduction is designed to engage the audience. I hate to reduce it to just that, because obviously there's a lot more that can happen there, but I think we're all trying to think about this hierarchy, and I think that that will definitely set them up well for both the writing multiple choice, but also the tasks that they're doing and all the other portions of the assessment. Yeah, Tim just made a good comment about methods of development and argument structure, which, as usual, Tim is much more eloquent in thinking in terms of that progression of claim evidence and commentary, right? And how that can impact an audience, how you persuade an audience. Okay, folks, well, we're just about at 7:30 here. So up on the slide, you've got my email address. If you want to do any follow-up with this, if you have any additional questions that we didn't get to this evening, I'll be more than happy to respond to those. It's the end of the semester for me, here over the next couple of weeks. I'm sure it's similar for a bunch of y'all. And so please be patient if I don't get back to you immediately. I'm probably just trying to clear semester finals, and I will start a dialogue with you as quickly as I can. Okay, folks. Thank you guys so much for being here this evening and giving up your personal time. Hope this was helpful, and I look forward to visiting with y'all in the future.